he told me while I was washing dishes. I was standing at the sink with my hands in warm, soapy water when my husband walked into the kitchen and said, "I need you to understand something. This isn't working anymore. You need more care than I can give you." I turned off the water and dried my hands slowly. He continued, "I found a place. It's clean. It's safe. They'll take good care of you." Then he said the part that made everything clear. "I need to move on with my life, Ellen. I'm not old yet." I looked at him and realized he had already rehearsed this conversation. He had already made his decision, probably with her. The woman whose perfume I had smelled on his collar last month. The one he said was no one. I nodded quietly and told him I understood. What he didn't know was that I had sold the house 3 days earlier to a private buyer my brother had found. The closing was final. The money was already transferred. And by Sunday night he would come home to find the locks changed and his belongings on the lawn. If you have ever stood in your own kitchen and felt like a stranger in your own life, you will understand why I'm telling you this story. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? Are you in London at midnight? Or Los Angeles in the afternoon? Leave me a comment and tell me. I read every single one. And if stories like this one speak to you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Sometimes knowing that someone else is listening on the other side of the world makes all the difference. My name is Margaret Ellen Foster. I am 67 years old. For 38 years, I was a high school librarian at Deering High School in Portland, Maine. I spent nearly 4 decades teaching teenagers how to find information in a world that was changing faster than any of us could track. I showed them how to cite sources and evaluate truth, and sit quietly with a book when the noise of the world became too much. I retired in June of 2019. I thought retirement would mean time to read, time to travel, time to finally organise the photographs that had been sitting in boxes in the basement since David was born. Robert and I bought our house at 142 Elmwood Avenue in the West End of Portland in the spring of 1981. It was a narrow 3-story Victorian with blue paint that was peeling even then, and a front porch that sloped slightly to the left. We paid $68,000 for it. Robert built an oak table for the dining room that summer. He sanded it by hand in the driveway while I painted the kitchen cabinets white. We planted a small garden in the backyard. Tomatoes, basil, zucchini that grew faster than we could eat it. Robert was a structural engineer. He worked for the same firm in South Portland for 41 years. He designed bridges and parking garages and the kinds of buildings people walk past without noticing, but that hold up the weight of entire cities. He believed in precision. He measured twice. He checked his calculations 3 times. He kept a pocket notebook in his shirt and wrote things down in small, careful handwriting. Appointments, grocery lists, the mileage on the car. He used to say that a structure was only as strong as the attention you gave it, that if you built something right, it would stand long after you were gone. We had one son, David Robert Foster. He was born on a Tuesday in October of 1982 at Maine Medical Center. He weighed 7 pounds and 4 ounces. He had Robert's dark hair and my pale blue eyes. When he was 4 years old, he asked me if the moon followed our car when we drove at night. I told him yes. He believed me for 2 more years. Our life was quiet in the way that good lives often are. We had Sunday dinners at the oak table Robert built. We drove to Acadia every August and stayed in the same cabin on the same week. We shoveled the driveway together in winter and raked leaves together in fall. Robert kept a coffee can on the kitchen counter where we saved spare change for no particular reason. By the time David left for college, that can held nearly $400 in quarters and dimes. My father, William Howard Foster, died in March of 2006. He was 79 years old. He had been a commercial fisherman most of his life, working out of Portland Harbour, bringing in cod and haddock and lobster. He was a quiet man who did not waste words. But he told me something once that I have never forgotten. I was 23 years old and newly married. He took me aside at my wedding reception and said, "Margaret, a woman who controls her own money controls her own life." I did not entirely understand what he meant then. I thought he was talking about paying bills and balancing checkbooks. It was only later that I realized he was talking about something much larger. After the funeral, I went through his things. There was not much. A few pieces of furniture, some tools, a desk he had kept in the corner of his bedroom for as long as I could remember. I opened the drawers one by one. In the bottom drawer, underneath a stack of old receipts and a faded road map of Maine, I found a small leather case about the size of a deck of cards. I opened it. Inside was a voice-activated recorder, the kind reporters used in the 1980s. I turned it over in my hands. The leather was worn smooth. I pressed the button. It still worked. I do not know why I kept it. Maybe because it had been his. Maybe because I remembered him using it once to record a conversation with a fish buyer who had tried to cheat him. I slipped it into my cardigan pocket and brought it home. I put it in the drawer of my nightstand and forgot about it. Life continued the way it always had. I worked, Robert worked. David got married to a woman named Ellen and had 2 daughters. We became grandparents. The years moved quietly. And then, on the morning of January 7th, 2023, I collapsed in my kitchen while making coffee. I remember the kettle whistling. I remember reaching for the counter. Then, nothing. I woke up 3 hours later in a bed at Maine Medical Center with Robert sitting in a chair beside me. A doctor I had never met came in and told me I had suffered a minor ischemic stroke. She used the word minor as if that would make it less frightening. She said I was lucky. The damage was small. I would recover fully. I would need to take medication. I would need to monitor my blood pressure. But I would be fine. I spent 3 days in the hospital. Robert visited every afternoon. David came once with the girls. They stood at the foot of my bed and looked at me like I was something fragile they were afraid to touch. On the 3rd day, Dr. Raymond Chen, my primary care physician for the past 12 years, came to see me. He sat on the edge of the bed and asked me how I was feeling. I told him I was tired. He nodded. He said that was normal. He said the brain needed time to heal, just like any other part of the body. He told me to rest. He told me not to rush. Then he signed my discharge papers and sent me home. Robert drove me back to Elmwood Avenue on a cold Thursday afternoon. The house felt different when I walked in. Quieter. He helped me upstairs to the bedroom. He brought me tea. He asked if I needed anything. I told him I was fine. He nodded and went back downstairs. That evening, someone knocked on the door. I heard Robert answer it. I heard a woman's voice, light, warm, familiar in a way I could not place. I heard footsteps on the stairs, Robert appeared in the doorway. Behind him was a woman I recognized but could not name. She smiled at me. She was younger than I was. Maybe 40, maybe 45. Blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. She wore jeans and a soft grey sweater. She carried a ceramic dish covered in aluminium foil. She stepped into the room and set the dish on the dresser. She said, "Margaret, I'm so glad you're home. I brought you a casserole, chicken and rice. I know how hard it is to think about cooking when you're recovering." I stared at her. Robert said, "This is Celeste. She works at Dr. Morrison's office. My dental hygienist. She heard about the stroke and wanted to help." Celeste stepped closer to the bed. She reached out and touched my hand. Her fingers were cool and soft. She said, "I've worked with a lot of stroke patients over the years. I know what you're going through. If you need anything at all, I'm here." I thanked her. I did not know what else to say. She smiled again. She told Robert she would check in tomorrow. Then she left. I heard her footsteps on the stairs. I heard the front door close. Robert sat down on the edge of the bed. He looked tired. He said, "She's very kind." I told him I was sure she was. What I did not say was that I had smelled her perfume before, a month earlier, on his collar. On a Tuesday night when he came home late from work and said he had been at a project meeting. I had not asked him about it then. I did not ask him about it now. Something about the way she touched my hand made the back of my neck go cold. Celeste came back the next day, and the day after that. She brought soup. She brought magazines. She sat in the chair beside my bed and talked about recovery and rest and how important it was to take things slowly. She told Robert he looked exhausted. She told him he needed to take care of himself too. She offered to stay with me for a few hours so he could go to the grocery store. He hesitated. Then he agreed. After he left, Celeste stood and walked to the window. She looked out at the street. She said, "You have a beautiful home." "Margaret, you and Robert have built a really beautiful life here." I said thank you. She turned and looked at me. She smiled, but her eyes were measuring something. I could feel it. She asked if I needed anything. I told her I was fine. She nodded. Then she walked out of the room. I heard her footsteps in the hallway. I heard a drawer open in the bathroom, then close. She came back a few minutes later and sat down in the chair. She folded her hands in her lap. She said, "I think you and I are going to be good friends, Margaret." I did not answer. I closed my eyes and pretended to sleep. After a while, I heard her leave. That night, I lay awake in the dark. Robert was asleep beside me. I listened to his breathing. I thought about Celeste's smile. I thought about the way she had touched the dresser, the window, the door frame, like she was learning the shape of the house, like she was measuring it for something. I thought about my father's words. A woman who controls her own money controls her own life. I did not know yet what Celeste wanted, but I knew, with a certainty that made my chest tighten, that she wanted something. And I knew that Robert, in his exhaustion and his fear, had already let her in. I got out of bed as quietly as I could. I walked downstairs in the dark. I went to the small desk in the corner of the living room where Robert kept bills and paperwork. I opened the top drawer. I found my checkbook. I found the folder with our mortgage statements. I found the deed to the house. I stood there in the dark, holding the deed in my hands, reading it by the light from the street. The house was in both our names, Joint tenants with right of survivorship. I put the deed back in the folder. I closed the drawer. I walked to the kitchen and stood at the window. The street was empty. The houses were dark. I thought about the casserole Celeste had brought. I thought about the way she had said, "You and Robert have built a really beautiful life here." Past tense, as if it were already over. I stood there for a long time. Then I went back upstairs. I got into bed. Robert did not wake. I lay there in the dark, listening to the sound of his breathing, and I made a decision. I would watch. I would listen. And I would wait. Because if there was one thing 38 years of working with teenagers had taught me, it was this. People always tell you who they are. You just have to pay attention. I woke the next morning to the sound of voices downstairs. Robert's voice and hers. I looked at the clock on the nightstand. 7:45. Robert usually left for work by 7:30. I got out of bed slowly. My legs felt steadier than they had the day before. I put on my robe and walked to the top of the stairs. I stood there, one hand on the banister, and listened. Celeste was saying something about medication. Her voice was calm and clear. She said, "I can pick up the refills for you if that would help. I know the pharmacy on Congress Street. I go right past it on my way home." Robert said, "That would be great. I appreciate it." Then Celeste said something I did not quite catch. Her voice dropped lower. I heard Robert laugh. It was a sound I had not heard in weeks, maybe longer. I walked down the stairs. My slippers made no sound on the carpet. When I reached the bottom, I turned toward the kitchen. They were standing near the counter. Celeste had a notebook in her hands. She was writing something down. Robert was holding a coffee cup. He looked up when he saw me. He said, "Morning, Margaret. Celeste is going to help us keep track of your medications." Celeste turned and smiled. She said, "Good morning. How are you feeling today?" I told her I was fine. She nodded and made a note in the notebook. She said, "That's good. It's important to monitor how you're feeling day to day. Sometimes the effects of a stroke can be subtle. You might not notice them right away." I looked at Robert. He was nodding. He believed her. He trusted her. I could see it in his face. Celeste closed the notebook. She said, "I should get going. I have a patient at 8:30. She looked at me. She said, "Margaret, I left my number on the refrigerator. If you need anything at all, just call." I thanked her. She touched Robert's arm lightly as she walked past him. Then she left. The front door closed. Robert finished his coffee. He said, "She's really been a lifesaver. I don't know what I would have done without her this week." I did not answer. I walked to the refrigerator. There was a small piece of paper held up by a magnet. Celeste's name. Her phone number. Her handwriting was round and neat, the kind of handwriting teachers use on classroom posters. Robert kissed me on the forehead. He said he would be home by 6. Then he left. I stood in the kitchen alone. The house was very quiet. I could hear the refrigerator humming. I could hear a car passing on the street outside. I walked to the window and looked out at the backyard. The garden we had planted in 1981 was overgrown now. We had stopped tending it years ago. The tomato cages were rusted. The fence was leaning. I thought about the way Celeste had touched Robert's arm. Lightly, briefly, but deliberately. I thought about the notebook in her hands. My medications, my symptoms, my day-to-day condition. All written down in her round, neat handwriting. I went back upstairs. I opened the drawer of my nightstand. The small leather case was still there. I took it out. I opened it. The voice recorder sat inside, old and worn but still functional. I held it in my hand. It was heavier than I remembered. I thought about my father. I thought about the fish buyer who had tried to cheat him. I thought about how my father had recorded their conversation and then played it back in front of 3 other buyers at the docks. The man had never tried to cheat him again. I closed the case. I slipped it into the pocket of my robe. That afternoon, Celeste came back. She let herself in without knocking. I heard the front door open. I heard her footsteps in the hallway. She called out, "Margaret, it's just me." I was sitting in the living room with a book. She came in and set a pharmacy bag on the coffee table. She said, "I picked up your refills, 3 months' worth. That should get you through spring." I thanked her. She sat down on the couch across from me. She folded her hands in her lap. She said, "How was your day? Did you rest?" I told her I had rested. She nodded. She said, "Good. Rest is the most important thing right now. Your brain is healing. You need to give it time." She looked around the room. Her eyes moved slowly. She looked at the bookshelf, the photographs on the mantel, the old clock Robert's father had given us. She said, "You have so many beautiful things. It must be hard to keep track of it all." I said, "I managed." She smiled. She said, "I'm sure you do." Then she stood. She walked to the bookshelf. She picked up a small ceramic bird that David had made in elementary school. She turned it over in her hands. She said, "This is sweet. Did David make this?" I said, "Yes." She set it back on the shelf, but not in the same place. She set it 2 inches to the left. I watched her. I did not say anything. She turned and looked at me. She said, "Margaret, I want you to know that I'm here for you. I know this is a difficult time. Strokes can be so disorienting. Sometimes people feel like they're losing control. But you're not alone. Robert and I are both here to help. Robert and I." She said it so naturally, as if they were a unit, as if I were the 3rd person in this house. I thanked her again. She smiled. She said she would see me tomorrow. Then she left. I sat in the living room for a long time after she was gone. I looked at the ceramic bird on the shelf. 2 inches to the left. I stood and moved it back to where it had been. Then I walked to the front window. I looked out at the street. Pauline Duclos was standing on her front porch 2 doors down. She was watering her plants. She looked up and saw me in the window. For a moment, our eyes met. Then she looked away. She went back inside her house. The door closed. That had never happened before. Pauline and I had been neighbours for 19 years. We waved. We talked at the mailbox. We borrowed sugar and returned casserole dishes. But today she had looked away. I wondered what Celeste had told her. The next morning, I woke to find my reading glasses on the bathroom counter. I had left them on the nightstand. I was certain of it. I picked them up and brought them back to the bedroom. I set them on the nightstand. I told myself I must have moved them in the night and forgotten. 2 days later, it happened again. This time they were on the kitchen table. Then, 3 days after that, they were in the living room on the arm of the couch. Each time, I told myself I must have carried them there. Each time, a small doubt grew larger. Robert started coming home later, 7:30, 8 o'clock, 9. He said the firm was behind on a project in Scarborough. He said they were working overtime to meet the deadline. I did not ask questions. I made dinner and kept it warm in the oven. Celeste came every afternoon. She let herself in with a key Robert had given her. She said it was easier this way. She said she did not want me to have to get up and answer the door every time. I told her I did not mind getting up. She smiled and said, "I know, but this is better." One afternoon in late February, she walked into the living room and looked at the coffee table. There was a stack of mail sitting there. Bills, a catalogue, a letter from my retirement fund. She picked up the stack and flipped through it. She said, "Margaret, are you keeping up with these? Some of them look overdue." I told her I had paid them. She looked at me. She said, "Are you sure? Sometimes after a stroke, people forget things like that. It's very common. Why don't you let me take a look? I can help you organize them." I told her I was organized. She smiled. She said, "I'm sure you are, but just to be safe." She took the stack of mail and walked into the kitchen. I heard her opening drawers. I stood and followed her. She was going through the drawer where Robert and I kept bills and checkbooks and receipts. She said, "Oh, this is a mess. When was the last time you went through this?" I told her I went through it every month. She did not look up. She said, "Well, it doesn't look like it." She pulled out a handful of envelopes. She said, "Some of these are from last year." I felt something tighten in my chest. I said, "Those are paid. They're just filed there." She looked at me. She said, "Margaret, I'm not criticizing you. I'm trying to help." She set the envelopes on the counter. She said, "Why don't I take these home and sort through them? I'll make sure everything is up to date. Then I'll bring them back organized." I told her that was not necessary. She reached out and touched my arm. She said, "I know it's not necessary, but I want to do it. You've been through so much. Let me help." I did not know how to say no without sounding ungrateful, so I nodded. She gathered the envelopes into a canvas bag she had brought. She said, "I'll have this back to you in a few days." Then she left. That evening, I went to the grocery store. I needed milk and bread and eggs. I took the bus. I did not like to drive anymore, not since the stroke. At the checkout, I handed the cashier my debit card. She swiped it. She waited. Then she swiped it again. She looked at me and said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, it's not going through." I told her to try it one more time. She did. Same result. She said, "Do you have another card?" I opened my wallet. I looked for my credit card. It was not there. I looked again. Only the debit card. I felt my face grow warm. There was a woman standing behind me in line. She was looking at her phone, pretending not to notice. The cashier said, "It's okay. It happens. Do you want to come back later?" I told her yes. I left the groceries on the counter. I walked out of the store. I stood on the sidewalk in the cold. My hands were shaking. Not from the cold, from something else. When I got home, Robert was in the kitchen. Celeste was there too. They were sitting at the table. There was a pizza box open between them. Robert looked up and said, "We didn't know when you'd be back, so we ordered something." I told him that was fine. I went to the bedroom. I opened my purse. I took everything out. Wallet, keys, tissues, a small notepad. My credit card was not there. I went back downstairs. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen. I said, "Robert, have you seen my credit card?" He looked at Celeste. She said, "Oh, Margaret, I have it. I picked it up the other day when I was organizing your mail. I didn't want you to lose it. It's in my bag. I'll bring it back tomorrow." I stared at her. I said, "Why do you have my credit card?" She smiled. She said, "I told you. I was organizing. I found it in the drawer with a bunch of receipts. I thought it would be safer if I held on to it for now. You've been forgetting things. I didn't want it to get misplaced." I said, "I haven't been forgetting things." She tilted her head. She said, "Margaret, you forgot where you put your glasses 3 times last week. Robert told me." I looked at Robert. He was looking at his pizza. He did not look at me. I said, "I need my credit card back." Celeste nodded. She said, "Of course. I'll bring it tomorrow, I promise." I turned and walked out of the kitchen. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed. My hands were still shaking. I pressed my thumbnail into the pad of my index finger. The small crescent mark appeared. I pressed harder. I thought about my father's words. A woman who controls her own money controls her own life. But I did not control my money anymore. Celeste had my credit card. She had my mail. She had a key to my house. I opened the drawer of my nightstand. I took out the small leather case. I opened it. The voice recorder was still there. I turned it on. The red light blinked. I turned it off. I put it back in the drawer. That night I could not sleep. I lay in the dark, listening to Robert breathe beside me. At some point I heard his phone buzz on the nightstand. Once, twice, 3 times. He did not wake. I turned my head and looked at the screen. The name on the display was C. I got out of bed. I went downstairs. I stood in the dark living room. I did not turn on the lights. I walked to Robert's desk in the corner. I opened the top drawer. Inside were pens and paperclips and a small stack of business cards. I opened the second drawer. Files, tax returns, insurance documents. I opened the bottom drawer. There was a manila folder I had never seen before. I took it out. I opened it. Inside were papers, a brochure. I carried the folder to the window where the streetlight came through. I read the brochure. Shady Pines Nursing and Rehabilitation Center. A photograph of a building. A smiling woman in scrubs. Text that said, "Compassionate memory care in a safe, supportive environment." There were notes in Robert's handwriting on the back. Private room, $8,700 per month. Memory care unit. Medicaid accepted after spend down. I stood there holding the brochure for a long time. Then I put it back in the folder. I put the folder back in the drawer. I closed the drawer. I walked back upstairs. I got into bed. Robert did not wake. The next morning, Celeste came back. She brought my credit card. She handed it to me and said, "See? Safe and sound." I told her thank you. She said, "Anytime." That afternoon, I was upstairs folding laundry when I heard voices downstairs. Celeste's voice. And another voice. A man's. I walked to the top of the stairs. I stood there quietly. The voices were coming from the kitchen. I could not hear everything, but I heard Celeste say, "The paperwork is moving faster than I expected." Then a pause. Then, "He signed the medical proxy yesterday." I felt my heart beat harder. I moved closer to the stairs. I heard her say, "No, she doesn't know. She won't know until the day of." Then I heard the man's voice, lower. I could not make out the words. Then Celeste again. She said, "I'll take care of it. Don't worry." I heard footsteps. I moved back from the stairs. I went into the bedroom. I stood by the window. A moment later, I heard the front door close. I looked out the window. A man in a dark coat was walking to a car parked on the street. He got in and drove away. I went downstairs. Celeste was standing in the kitchen putting on her coat. She looked up and said, "Oh, Margaret, I didn't know you were upstairs." I had a friend stop by. He was just leaving. I asked who he was. She said, "Just someone from work. He needed to drop off some paperwork." She smiled. She said, "I should get going. I have errands to run. I'll see you tomorrow." She left. I stood in the kitchen. The house was very quiet. I thought about what I had heard. Medical proxy. She won't know until the day of. I thought about the brochure in Robert's desk. Shady Pines, Memory Care Unit. I walked to the phone on the kitchen wall. I picked up the receiver. I dialed a number I had not called in months. It rang 3 times. Then a voice said, "Hello?" I said, "Linda, it's Margaret." Linda Kowalski had been my closest friend for 26 years. We taught at Deering together. We retired the same year. We used to meet for coffee every Thursday. But I had not seen her since the stroke. Celeste had told people I was too tired for visitors. Linda said, "Margaret, oh my God, I've been so worried. How are you?" I told her I needed to talk to her. She said, "Of course. When?" I said, "Can you meet me tomorrow, somewhere outside the house?" There was a pause. Then Linda said, "Yes." "Where?" I told her the Hannaford on Forest Avenue. 1 o'clock. By the pharmacy. She said she would be there. I hung up. I stood by the phone for a moment. Then I walked to the living room. I looked at the mantel. The photographs that had been there for years were gone. The one of David's wedding, the one of Robert and me in Acadia, the one of my parents on their 40th anniversary. All gone. I walked upstairs. I opened the linen closet. The photographs were there, stacked in a cardboard box, face down. I took the box out. I brought it downstairs. I put the photographs back on the mantel, one by one. When I was finished, I stepped back and looked at them. The house grew quieter than it had ever been. Pauline stopped waving. The mailman stopped asking how I was feeling. By the 3rd week of March, I realized I had not spoken to anyone except Robert and Celeste in days. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook. I wrote down everything I could remember. The glasses moved, the credit card taken, the mail removed, the overheard conversation, the brochure, the missing photographs. I wrote slowly. My handwriting was smaller than it used to be. When I finished, I tore the page out. I folded it. I put it in the pocket of my robe. Robert came home at 9:15. He said he had been working late again. He smelled like perfume. Not his cologne. Hers. I did not say anything. I made him a sandwich. He ate it standing at the counter. He said, "Celeste thinks you're doing really well. She says you're adjusting." I said, "Adjusting to what?" He looked at me. He said, "To everything, the stroke, the recovery." He paused. He said, "She's been a real help, Margaret. I don't know what we would have done without her." I looked at him. I thought about the brochure in his desk. I thought about the medical proxy Celeste had mentioned. I thought about my father's words. A woman who controls her own money controls her own life. I said, "Robert, I'm fine." "I don't need help." He nodded. He said, "I know you think that. But sometimes people don't see what's right in front of them." He finished his sandwich. He went upstairs. I stayed in the kitchen. I sat at the table in the dark. I thought about the house on Elmwood Avenue. I thought about the oak table Robert had built. I thought about 42 years. And I realized for the first time that he had already made his decision. He had already chosen her. I just did not know yet what that decision was going to cost him. The next morning, I woke before Robert. The sky outside was still dark. I got dressed quietly. I put on my coat and my shoes. I took $20 from the envelope I kept in my dresser drawer, the envelope that Celeste did not know about. I walked downstairs and out the front door. The air was cold and sharp. I walked to the bus stop on the corner of Elmwood and Brackett. The bus came at 6:42. I got on. I sat near the back. There were only 3 other people on the bus: a man in a construction vest, a woman in hospital scrubs, a teenager with headphones. No one looked at me. I watched the streets pass, the old brick buildings, the bare trees, the coffee shops that were just turning on their lights. I got off at Congress Street. I walked 2 blocks to Portland Savings Bank. I waited outside until they opened at 8. When the doors unlocked, I went in. I walked to the counter. A young woman with dark hair looked up and smiled. She said, "Good morning. How can I help you?" I told her I needed to see my account balance. She asked for my ID. I gave her my driver's license. She typed something into her computer. She looked at the screen. Then she looked at me. She said, "Which account?" I told her, "My checking account." She said, "Okay." She typed again. She said, "Your balance is $147.63. I stared at her. I said, "That's not right. There should be more than that." She looked at the screen again. She said, "There were several withdrawals over the past 3 weeks. Do you want me to print a statement?" I told her yes. She printed it. She handed it to me. I looked at the paper. Withdrawal, $200, February 14th. Withdrawal, $300, February 19th. Withdrawal, $500, March 2nd. Withdrawal, $1,200, March 8th. I looked at the dates. I looked at the amounts. My hands started to shake. I said, "I didn't make these withdrawals." The woman looked uncomfortable. She said, "The withdrawals were made with your debit card at ATMS. Do you still have your card?" I opened my purse. I looked in my wallet. My debit card was there, but I had not used it. Not since Celeste had taken it and then returned it. I looked at the statement again. The $1,200 withdrawal on March 8th. That was 2 days after Celeste gave my card back. I folded the statement. I put it in my purse. I thanked the woman. I walked out of the bank. I stood on the sidewalk. The sun was up now. People were walking past me, going to work, going to coffee shops, living their ordinary mornings. I thought about Celeste's round, neat handwriting. I thought about the way she had smiled when she handed me my card and said, "See? Safe and sound." I walked back to the bus stop. I waited. The bus came. I got on. I rode home. When I walked in the front door, Robert was in the kitchen. He looked surprised. He said, "Where were you?" I told him I went for a walk. He said, "Margaret, you shouldn't go out alone. What if something happened?" I told him nothing happened. I went upstairs. I took the statement out of my purse. I put it in the drawer of my nightstand with the voice recorder. Then I sat on the edge of the bed. I pressed my thumbnail into my index finger. The crescent mark appeared. I thought about $2,100. Gone. That afternoon, Celeste came by. She let herself in. She called out, "Margaret, it's me!" I was in the living room. She came in and sat down. She said, "How are you feeling today?" I told her I was fine. She looked at me. She said, "You look tired. Did you sleep well?" I told her I slept fine. She nodded. She said, "You know, Margaret, it's important to stay on a regular schedule. Going to bed at the same time every night, waking up at the same time every morning. It helps with recovery." I did not answer. She stood and walked to the bookshelf. She picked up a small, framed photograph of David when he was 10 years old. She looked at it. She said, "He was such a cute kid. Does he visit much?" I told her he visited when he could. She set the photograph down. Not where it had been. 3 inches to the right. She said, "It must be hard, being alone so much of the day." I said, "I'm not alone. Robert is here in the evenings." She smiled. She said, "I know, but Robert works so hard. He's so devoted to his job." She paused. She said, "He's been under a lot of stress lately. I think he's worried about you." I looked at her. I said, "He doesn't need to worry about me." She tilted her head. She said, "Margaret, I think he does." She sat back down. She folded her hands in her lap. She said, "I know this is hard to hear, but sometimes people who've had strokes don't realize how much they've changed. They feel fine, but the people around them can see things they can't." I said, "What things?" She said, "Memory problems, confusion, difficulty with daily tasks. It's very common, and it's nothing to be ashamed of." I felt something cold move through my chest. I said, "I don't have memory problems." She smiled, a patient smile, the kind you use with children. She said, "I know you don't think you do, but Robert has noticed things. We've talked about it." I said, "What have you talked about?" She said, "Just ways to help you, ways to make sure you're safe." She reached out and patted my hand. She said, "We both care about you so much, Margaret. We just want what's best." I pulled my hand back. I said, "I appreciate your concern, but I'm fine." She stood. She said, "Of course you are." She picked up her purse. She said, "I'll see you tomorrow." After she left, I sat in the living room for a long time. The light coming through the windows changed. Morning became afternoon. I thought about the way she had said, "We've talked about it. We both care about you." As if she and Robert were a unit. As if they were the ones making decisions about my life. I thought about my father standing in his kitchen 30 years ago, holding that voice recorder. The next morning, I walked to the mailbox at the end of the driveway. It was early. The street was quiet. I opened the mailbox and pulled out a handful of catalogues and envelopes. I was turning to walk back to the house when I heard a voice. Margaret. I looked up. Pauline was standing on her front porch 2 doors down. She was holding a watering can. She did not smile. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I saw the van." I stared at her. I said, "What van?" But she had already turned and walked back inside her house. The door closed. I stood there holding the mail. My hands were cold. I looked up and down the street. I did not see a van. I walked back to the house. I went inside. I set the mail on the kitchen counter. I stood there trying to understand what Pauline had meant. Then I remembered. 2 days ago, late afternoon, I had been upstairs. I had heard a vehicle pull up in front of the house. I had looked out the window. A white van. Something printed on the side. I had not been able to read it from that angle. Robert had gone outside to talk to the driver. They had stood on the front steps for several minutes. Then the van had driven away. I walked to the living room. I looked out the front window. The street was empty. I turned and walked to Robert's desk in the corner. I opened the bottom drawer. The manila folder was still there. I took it out. I opened it. The brochure for Shady Pines was on top. I looked at it more carefully now. There was a phone number printed at the bottom. I picked up the phone on the desk. I dialed the number. A woman answered. She said, "Shady Pines Nursing and Rehabilitation. How may I help you?" I said, "I'm calling to ask about your services." She said, "Of course. Are you looking for a placement for yourself or a family member?" I said, "A family member." She asked for the name. I gave her my own name, Margaret Foster. There was a pause. I heard typing. Then the woman said, "Yes, we have a file here for Margaret Foster. The application was submitted on March 4th. We're just waiting for the final medical documentation." I felt my chest tighten. I said, "Who submitted the application?" She said, "Let me see. It looks like it was submitted by Robert Foster. Is that your husband?" I said yes. I asked what medical documentation was needed. She said, "We need a physician's statement confirming the need for memory care services. Once we have that, we can move forward with the admission process." I thanked her. I hung up. I stood there holding the phone. March 4th. That was 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, Robert had applied to put me in a nursing home, and I had not known. I put the folder back in the drawer. I closed it. I walked upstairs. I went to the bedroom. I opened the closet. I pushed aside the winter coats. In the back corner was a small fireproof safe my father had installed when we moved into this house in 1981. Robert had never used it. He did not know the combination, but I did. I knelt down. I turned the dial. Right, left, right. The lock clicked. I opened the door. Inside were documents I had not looked at in years. My birth certificate, my parents' marriage license, the deed to the house, and a sealed envelope with my name written on it in my father's handwriting. I took the envelope out. I opened it. Inside was a letter. The paper was yellowed. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. "Margaret," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then something has happened, and you need to know what I have built for you." I read the letter slowly. My father explained that in 1973, he and a man named James Callahan had started a seafood processing company, Foster and Callahan. They had been equal partners. In 1989, James had retired and sold his 50% stake to my father for $65,000. My father had restructured the company, and in 1996, he had transferred 60% ownership to me. The ownership was held in an irrevocable trust managed by an attorney named Donald Marsh. The letter gave Donald's name and address: Marsh and Associates, 477 Congress Street, Portland. At the bottom of the letter, my father had written one more thing. "Margaret, a woman who controls her own money, controls her own life. This company will feed you whether your husband loves you or not. Use it if you need it. I built it for you." I folded the letter. I put it back in the envelope. I took the deed to the house. I took my birth certificate. I closed the safe. I stood. I walked to the nightstand. I opened the drawer. I took out the small leather case with the voice recorder. I put the envelope and the documents and the recorder in my purse. Then I heard the front door open downstairs. Robert's voice. And hers. I walked to the top of the stairs. I stood there. I could hear them in the kitchen. Robert said something I could not make out. Then Celeste laughed. Then I heard her say, "I think we should tell her today." Robert said, "Are you sure?" Celeste said, "The paperwork is ready. Dr. Morrison signed the statement yesterday. We can move her this weekend." I felt my heart beating in my throat. I walked down the stairs, slowly, quietly. I reached the bottom. I walked to the kitchen doorway. They were standing near the counter. Robert had his back to me. Celeste was facing him. She saw me first. Her expression did not change. She smiled. She said, "Margaret, we were just talking about you." Robert turned. He looked tired. He said, "Margaret, we need to talk." I said, "About what?" He glanced at Celeste. She nodded. He said, "We think it's time for you to get some additional help, more than we can provide here at home." I said, "What kind of help?" Celeste stepped forward. She said, "Margaret, we've found a wonderful place for you. It's called Shady Pines. They specialize in memory care. You'll have your own room. There are activities, nurses on staff 24 hours a day. You'll be safe there." I looked at Robert. I said, "You want to put me in a nursing home?" He said, "It's not like that. It's just for a little while, until you're stronger." Celeste said, "We've already packed a bag for you. Just some clothes and toiletries. You won't need much." I looked at her. I said, "You packed my bags?" She smiled. She said, "I wanted to help. I know how overwhelming this can be." Robert said, "Margaret, this is what's best. For everyone." I felt something very cold and very clear move through me. I looked at Celeste. I looked at Robert. I said, "When?" Robert said, "This weekend, Saturday morning." Celeste touched his arm. She said, "It's going to be fine, Robert. She's going to be so much happier there." I stood in the doorway. My hands were at my sides. I looked at the kitchen counter, at the oak table Robert had built 42 years ago. I heard the refrigerator humming. I heard a car pass on the street outside. I made a decision in that moment that I did not speak aloud. I would let them think they had won. I would let them pack my bags. I would let them believe I was confused and weak and easy to move. And while they believed that, I would do what needed to be done. I said, "All right." Robert looked surprised. He said, "Really?" I said, "If you think it's best." Celeste smiled. She said, "Oh, Margaret, this is going to be so good for you. You'll see." I nodded. I turned and walked out of the kitchen. I went upstairs. I closed the bedroom door. I sat on the edge of the bed. I opened my purse. I took out the envelope from my father. I read the letter one more time. Then I took out my phone. It was an old flip phone I barely used, but it still worked. I opened it. I found the number for information. I called. I asked for the number for Marsh & Associates on Congress Street in Portland. The operator gave me the number. I wrote it down on a piece of paper. I hung up. I dialed the number. A woman answered. She said, "Marsh & Associates?" I said, "I need to speak with Donald Marsh. My name is Margaret Foster. My father was William Foster." There was a pause. Then the woman said, "One moment, please." I waited. I heard hold music. Then a man's voice came on the line. He said, "Margaret, is that you?" I said, "Yes." He said, "I haven't heard from you in years. How are you?" I said, "I need to see you, as soon as possible." He said, "Of course. When?" I said, "Today, this afternoon." He said, "I have an opening at 3. Can you make that?" I told him I could. He gave me the address. I told him I remembered it. He said, "Margaret, is everything all right?" I said, "I'll explain when I see you." I hung up. I looked at the clock on the nightstand. It was 11:30. I had 3.5 hours. I stood. I walked to the closet. I found my good coat, the navy blue one I wore to church. I put it on. I looked in the mirror. I looked like myself. Not confused, not weak. Myself. I picked up my purse. I walked downstairs. Robert and Celeste were still in the kitchen. I could hear them talking. I did not stop. I walked to the front door. I opened it. I stepped outside. I closed the door behind me. I walked down the driveway. I walked to the bus stop on the corner of Elmwood and Brackett. The bus came at 11:52. I got on. I sat near the back. I watched the streets pass. I thought about my father. I thought about the company he had built. I thought about the trust he had created. I thought about the words he had written. A woman who controls her own money controls her own life. I got off at Congress Street. I walked 3 blocks. I found the building, Marsh and Associates. A brick building with tall windows. I walked inside. There was a small lobby with a receptionist behind a desk. I told her my name. She smiled. She said, "Mr. Marsh is expecting you. 3rd floor, office 302. I took the elevator. The doors opened on the 3rd floor. I walked down the hallway. I found office 302. I knocked. A voice said, "Come in." I opened the door. Donald Marsh was sitting behind a desk. He was older than I remembered. His hair was grey now, but his face was kind. He stood when he saw me. He said, "Margaret, it's been too long." I said, "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice." He gestured to a chair. I sat down. He sat back down behind his desk. He folded his hands. He said, "What can I do for you?" I opened my purse. I took out the envelope from my father. I handed it to him. He opened it. He read the letter. He looked up at me. He said, "You found this recently?" I said, "This morning." He nodded. He said, "Your father was a very careful man. He wanted to make sure you were protected." I said, "I need to know what I have." He stood. He walked to a filing cabinet against the wall. He opened a drawer. He pulled out a manila folder. He brought it back to the desk. He opened it. He said, "Foster and Callahan's Seafood Processing. Your father transferred 60% ownership to you in March of 1996. The ownership is held in an irrevocable trust. I am the trustee." I said, "What is it worth?" He looked at a paper in the folder. He said, "As of last month, the company is valued at approximately $7.8 million. Your 60% stake is worth $4,732,000. I sat very still. I heard his words, but they felt distant, like they were being spoken to someone else. $4,732,000. Donald said, "Margaret, are you all right?" I said, "Yes, I'm fine." I pressed my thumbnail into my index finger. The crescent mark appeared. I said, "Does anyone else know about this?" He said, "No. Your father specifically instructed me not to tell anyone unless you asked. Not even your husband." I said, "Robert doesn't know." He said, "No." I looked at the folder on his desk. I said, "What can I do with it?" He said, "It's yours. You can sell your stake, you can take dividend payments, you can transfer ownership. You can do whatever you want." I said, "Can I use it as collateral?" He said, "For what?" I said, "I need to move quickly. I need to protect myself. And I think I need to sell my house." He looked at me carefully. He said, "Margaret, what's going on?" I told him. I told him about the stroke, about Celeste, about the credit card and the bank withdrawals and the medical proxy and the application to Shady Pines. I told him about the bags packed in my bedroom. I told him about Saturday morning. I spoke calmly. I did not cry. When I finished, Donald was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you have the deed to the house?" I took it out of my purse. I handed it to him. He looked at it. He said, "Joint tenancy with right of survivorship. If you sell the house, Robert is entitled to half." I said, "Can I transfer my share to the trust?" He thought for a moment. He said, "Yes. If you transfer your ownership interest to the trust before the sale, it complicates his claim, especially if we file for legal separation and allege financial abuse." I said, "How long would that take?" He said, "I can file the paperwork today. We can have the house listed by tomorrow. If we price it right, we can have an offer within a week." I said, "Do it." He looked at me. He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I'm sure." He nodded. He picked up the phone on his desk. He dialed a number. He said, "Sarah, it's Donald Marsh. I need you to come to my office. I have a client who needs to list a house immediately." He listened. He said, "Yes, today." He hung up. He looked at me. He said, "Sarah Lim is the best real estate attorney in Portland. She'll take care of you." I said, "Thank you." He said, "Margaret, I need to ask you something. Are you safe at home right now?" I thought about Robert. I thought about Celeste. I said, "For now, but not after Saturday." He said, "Do you have somewhere you can go?" I said, "Not yet." He wrote something on a piece of paper. He handed it to me. He said, "This is the name of a short-term rental agency. Tell them I sent you. They can find you an apartment by the end of the week." I took the paper. I put it in my purse. I said, "What do I owe you?" He said, "Nothing. Your father paid a retainer 27 years ago that still covers my time." He smiled. He said, "He knew you might need me someday." I stood. I shook his hand. I said, "Thank you, Donald." He said, "Call me if you need anything. Anything at all." I left his office. I walked back down the hallway. I took the elevator to the lobby. I walked outside. The sun was lower now. The air was colder. I stood on the sidewalk. I felt something I had not felt in months. I felt like myself. I walked to the bus stop. I waited. A woman stood beside me. She was younger than me, maybe 50. She had a grocery bag in her arms. She looked at me and smiled. She said, "Cold today?" I said, "Yes, very cold." She said, "Spring will be here soon." I said, "I hope so." The bus came. We got on. I sat near the back. I looked out the window. I thought about what Donald had said. $4,732,000. I thought about my father. I thought about the company he had built. I thought about the letter he had written. I thought about the words he had chosen. Use it if you need it. I built it for you. I got off the bus at Elmwood and Brackett. I walked home. When I opened the front door, the house was quiet. Robert's car was not in the driveway. I walked upstairs. I went to the bedroom. I opened the closet. On the floor was a small suitcase. I opened it. Inside were my clothes, folded neatly. My nightgowns, my slippers, my sweaters. Everything packed by someone else's hands. I closed the suitcase. I pushed it back into the closet. I walked to the window. I looked out at the street. Pauline's porch light was on. I thought about what she had said. I saw the van. I understood now what she had been trying to tell me. And I understood something else. Something that made my hands steady and my breathing slow. They thought I was weak. They thought I was confused. They thought I would go quietly into that van on Saturday morning and disappear into a building where no one would hear me. But they were wrong. The next morning, I left the house before Robert woke. I took the bus downtown. I walked 3 blocks to the office of Sarah Lim on Exchange Street. She met me in the lobby at 9 o'clock exactly. She was younger than I expected, maybe 40. She wore a grey suit and carried a leather folder. She shook my hand. Her grip was firm. She said, "Darnell told me about your situation. I'm going to help you." We took the elevator to the 4th floor. Her office was small and bright. There were windows overlooking the street. She gestured to a chair. I sat. She sat across from me. She opened the folder. She said, "I need to see the deed." I took it out of my purse. I handed it to her. She read it carefully. She said, "Joint tenancy. That complicates things." "But Donald said you're transferring your interest to a trust." I said, "Yes. He's filing the paperwork today." She nodded. She said, "Once that's done, I can list the house. We'll price it competitively. $479,000. It should move quickly." I said, "How quickly?" She said, "In this market, with a house in the West End in good condition, I'd say a week, maybe less." I said, "And Robert?" She looked at me. She said, "He'll find out when the listing goes live. He can contest it. But if the trust transfer is already filed and we have documentation of financial abuse, his legal standing is weak." She paused. She said, "Do you have documentation?" I took out the bank statement from Portland's savings. I handed it to her. She looked at it. She said, "This is good. Unauthorized withdrawals using your debit card. Do you have anything else?" I told her about the medical proxy, about the application to Shady Pines. She wrote everything down. She said, "We'll need a letter from your doctor confirming you're competent. Can you get that?" I said, "I can try." She said, "Try today. The faster we move, the better." I stood. I thanked her. She walked me to the door. She said, "Margaret, you're doing the right thing. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I took the bus to Dr. Chen's office on Forest Avenue. I did not have an appointment. I told the receptionist it was urgent. She said Dr. Chen was fully booked. I said, "Please, tell him it's Margaret Foster." She looked at me. Then she picked up the phone. She spoke quietly. She hung up. She said, "He'll see you in 15 minutes." I sat in the waiting room. There was a television mounted on the wall. The sound was off. A morning show, people laughing. I did not watch it. I looked at my hands. The crescent marks from my thumbnail were still visible on my index finger. After 12 minutes, the receptionist called my name. I followed her down a hallway. She opened a door. Dr. Chen was sitting at a desk. He stood when he saw me. He said, "Margaret, what's wrong?" I told him I needed a letter. I told him what the letter needed to say. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Margaret, are you in danger?" I said, "Not yet, but I will be if I don't act now." He nodded. He turned to his computer. He typed. He said, "I'm going to write that you suffered a transient ischemic stroke on January 7th of this year, that you were hospitalized for 3 days, that you made a full recovery with no residual cognitive impairment, that you are mentally competent to manage your own affairs. Is that accurate?" I said yes. He printed the letter. He signed it. He handed it to me. He said, "If you need anything else, call me, day or night." I folded the letter. I put it in my purse. I said, "Thank you, Raymond." He said, "Be careful." I left his office. I took the bus home. When I walked in the front door, the house was empty. Robert's car was gone. I walked upstairs. I went to the bedroom. I opened the closet. The suitcase was still there on the floor. I knelt down. I unzipped it. I took out the clothes Celeste had packed. I put them back on the hangers. I put the suitcase back in the corner of the closet. Empty. Then I heard the front door open downstairs. Footsteps. 2 sets. Robert's voice. And hers. I stood. I walked to the top of the stairs. I listened. Celeste was saying something about timing. Her voice was low but clear. She said, "The van comes at 9 on Saturday. We'll have her out by 9:30. Then we can start clearing the house." Robert said, "What do you mean, clearing the house?" Celeste said, "Robert, we talked about this. Once she's settled, we can start getting rid of things. The furniture, the books, all that clutter. We'll make it ours." There was a pause. Then Robert said, "I don't know, Celeste. That feels fast." She said, "It's not fast, it's practical. The house closes on the 19th. We need to be ready." I felt my chest tighten. I pressed my hand against the wall. I controlled my breathing. In, out. In, out. I heard Robert say, "The house closes? What are you talking about?" Celeste said, "Oh, I thought I told you. I found a buyer, a cousin of mine in New Hampshire. He's paying cash, 400,000. It's a good deal." Robert said, "Celeste, I didn't agree to sell the house." She laughed, a light sound. She said, "Robert, you can't keep it. You can't afford it on your own. And once Margaret is gone, you won't need all this space. My cousin is doing us a favor." Robert said nothing. I heard the refrigerator hum. I heard a car pass outside. I heard Celeste say, "Trust me, this is what's best for everyone." I stepped back from the stairs. I walked to the bedroom. I sat on the edge of the bed. I thought about what I had just heard. The house closes on the 19th. 400,000. My cousin in New Hampshire. Robert did not know he was being lied to. He thought he was moving me to a nursing home so I could be cared for. He did not know Celeste was planning to take the house. He did not know she had already found a buyer. He did not know she had been stealing from me for weeks. For a moment, I felt something almost like pity for him. But only for a moment. I opened my purse. I took out my phone. I called Donald Marsh. He answered on the second ring. I said, "Donald, it's Margaret. The paperwork. Is it filed?" He said, "Yes. I filed it this morning. Your interest in the house has been transferred to the trust. As of 10:15 this morning, you are the sole authorized seller." I said, "Good. Tell Sarah to list it today." He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I'm sure." He said, "It'll go live at midnight." I said, "Perfect." I hung up. I stood. I walked to the window. I looked out at the street. I thought about my father's words. A woman who controls her own money controls her own life. I had said those words to myself so many times in the past 2 months. But now, for the first time, I felt their full weight. Not as a memory, as a fact. I heard footsteps on the stairs. Robert appeared in the doorway. He looked tired. He said, "Margaret, can we talk?" I said, "Of course." He sat down on the edge of the bed. He said, "I know this weekend is going to be hard, but I think it's the right thing. Shady Pines is a good place. You'll be safe there." I said, "I know you think that." He looked at me. He said, "Celeste has been such a help through all of this. I don't know what I would have done without her." I said, "I'm sure." He stood. He said, "I'm going to run some errands. I'll be back in a few hours." He walked to the door, then he stopped. He turned. He said, "Margaret, I do love you. You know that, right?" I looked at him. I said, "I know you think you do." He left. I heard his footsteps on the stairs. I heard the front door close. I heard his car start. I waited until the sound faded. Then I stood. I walked to the closet. I took out the small leather case from the drawer of my nightstand. I opened it. The voice recorder was inside. I turned it on. The red light blinked. I put it in the pocket of my cardigan. Then I went downstairs. Celeste was in the kitchen. She was on her phone. She did not hear me. I stood in the hallway just outside the kitchen door. I listened. She was saying, "No, she doesn't suspect anything. She's too out of it." Then a pause. Then, "The facility in Bangor is cheaper, $900 a month. Medicaid covers it." "No, Robert doesn't know. He thinks she's going to Shady Pines. But that place costs $9,000 a month. Why would I waste that kind of money?" Another pause. Then, "It's done. The paperwork is signed. She'll be gone by Saturday." I reached into my pocket. I felt the recorder. The red light was still blinking. I stood there for another 30 seconds. Then Celeste said, "I have to go. I'll call you later." She hung up. I stepped back. I walked quietly to the front door. I opened it. I closed it loudly. I called out, "Celeste, are you here?" She came out of the kitchen. She smiled. She said, "Oh, Margaret, I didn't hear you come in." I said, "I just got back from a walk." She said, "That's good. Fresh air is important." She looked at me. She said, "Are you feeling all right? You look pale." I said, "I'm fine, just tired." She nodded. She said, "You should rest. Saturday is a big day." I said, "I will." She picked up her purse from the counter. She said, "I'll see you tomorrow." She walked past me. She opened the front door. She turned. She said, "Margaret, everything is going to be okay. You'll see." I said, "I know." She left. I closed the door. I locked it. I walked to the living room. I sat down on the couch. I took the recorder out of my pocket. I pressed stop. I rewound it. I pressed play. Celeste's voice filled the room. Clear. Unmistakable. The facility in Bangor is cheaper. $900 a month. No, Robert doesn't know. He thinks she's going to Shady Pines. I pressed stop. I held the recorder in my hands. I thought about my father. I thought about the fish buyer who had tried to cheat him. I thought about how my father had played the recording back in front of witnesses. I thought about how the man had never tried to cheat him again. I put the recorder back in my pocket. I stood. I walked to the phone on the kitchen wall. I called Linda. She answered on the third ring. She said, "Margaret, how are you?" I said, "Linda, I need your help. Can you come over tomorrow morning? Early. Before Robert leaves for work." She said, "Of course. What time?" I said, 7. She said, "I'll be there." I hung up. I stood in the kitchen. The light was fading outside. The house was very quiet. I walked to the window. I looked out at the backyard. The garden was overgrown. The fence was leaning. But the oak tree Robert and I had planted in 1981 was still standing. Tall, strong, unmoved by 42 years of weather. I thought about the letter my father had written. Use it if you need it. I built it for you. I thought about the trust. $4,732,000. I thought about the house, listed at midnight. I thought about the recorder in my pocket. I thought about Saturday morning, 9 o'clock, the van. And I realized something that made my hands steady and my breathing slow. I was not the one who needed to be afraid. The next morning, Linda arrived at 6:55. I let her in. She hugged me. She said, "What's going on?" I told her everything. I spoke quietly. I did not rush. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "What do you need me to do?" I said, "I need you to be here tomorrow morning. I need a witness." She said, "I'll be here." Robert came downstairs at 7:15. He stopped when he saw Linda. He said, "Linda, I didn't know you were coming over." Linda smiled. She said, "Margaret called me. We're having coffee." Robert looked at me, then at Linda. Then he said, "Okay." He picked up his briefcase. He said, "I'll see you tonight." He left. Linda and I sat at the kitchen table. She said, "Margaret, are you sure about this?" I said, "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." She reached across the table. She took my hand. She said, "Then I'm with you." That afternoon, Sarah Lim called. She said, "Margaret, we have an offer. Full price, cash. The buyer wants to close in 14 days. I said, "I accept." She said, "I'll send the paperwork. You'll need to sign by tomorrow." I said, "I'll come to your office in the morning." She said, "Margaret, the listing went live at midnight. Robert is going to see it." I said, "I know." She said, "Be careful." I hung up. I sat in the living room. I waited. At 6:30, Robert came home. He walked in the front door. He did not call out. He walked straight to the living room. He was holding his phone. He looked at me. He said, "Margaret, what is this?" I said, "What is what?" He held up his phone. He said, "Our house is listed for sale. On Zillow. It says the seller is Margaret Foster, trustee." I said, "Yes?" He stared at me. He said, "What are you talking about?" You can't sell this house without me. I said, actually, I can. I transferred my ownership interest to a trust on Tuesday. As of Wednesday morning, I am the sole authorized seller. His face went pale. He said, You can't do that. I said, I already did. He sat down on the couch. He put his head in his hands. He said, Margaret, I don't understand. Why would you do this? I said, because you are going to put me in a nursing home and sell the house out from under me. He looked up. He said, That's not true. Shady Pines is for you, so you can get the care you need. I said, Robert, I don't need care. I had a stroke. I recovered. Dr. Chen confirmed it in writing. I'm fine. He said, But Celeste said. I said, Celeste lied. He stared at me. He said, What are you talking about? I reached into my pocket. I took out the recorder. I set it on the coffee table between us. I said, Listen. I pressed play. Celeste's voice filled the room. The facility in Bangor is cheaper, $900 a month. No, Robert doesn't know. He thinks she's going to Shady Pines, but that place costs $9,000 a month. Why would I waste that kind of money? Robert's face changed, slowly, like he was hearing words in a language he did not quite understand. I let the recording play. Celeste's voice continued. The house closes on the 19th. $400,000. My cousin in New Hampshire. I pressed stop. The room was silent. Robert did not move. He stared at the recorder. Then he looked at me. He said, When did you record this? I said, Yesterday. He said, She was going to put you in a state facility. I said, Yes. He said, And sell the house? I said, Yes, for $400,000, to a cousin who probably doesn't exist. He stood. He walked to the window. He did not speak. I watched him. I watched his shoulders. I watched the way his hands opened and closed at his sides. Finally, he said, I didn't know. I said, I know. He turned. He said, Margaret, I swear to you, I didn't know. I said, I believe you. He sat back down. He said, What happens now? I said, The house sold this afternoon. Full price. $479,000. It closes in 2 weeks. You're entitled to half under joint tenancy law. But given the circumstances, my attorney believes your claim will be contested. He said, I don't want half. I looked at him. I said, What? He said, I don't want anything. Keep it. Keep all of it. He put his face in his hands. He said, I'm so sorry, Margaret. I thought I was helping you. I thought Celeste was helping you. I said, She wasn't helping me, Robert. She was stealing from me, and she was stealing from you. He looked up. He said, What do you mean? I handed him the bank statement from Portland Savings. He read it. He said, $2,100. I said, She had my debit card. She told me she was holding it for safekeeping. He set the statement down. He said, Jesus Christ. I said, There's more. She convinced you to sign a medical proxy giving her authority over my care. She applied to put me in a nursing home without my knowledge. And she's been moving things in this house for weeks to make me think I was losing my memory. He stood. He walked to the door. He said, Where is she? I said, I don't know. He said, I'm going to find her. I said, Robert, wait. He stopped. He turned. I said, Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. She's expecting the van from Shady Pines. Let her come. Let her think everything is going according to plan. He said, Why? I said, Because I want her to see what happens when you underestimate a woman who knows exactly what she has. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. He said, Okay. That night, I did not sleep. I lay in the dark, listening to Robert breathe beside me. At some point, I heard him say my name, quietly. I did not answer. I pretended to sleep. At 6:30 in the morning, I got up. I got dressed. I made coffee. Linda arrived at 7. David arrived at 7:15. I had called him the night before. I had told him to come. I had not told him why. He walked in and saw Linda. He said, Mum, what's going on? I said, Sit down. He sat. I told him everything. I did not soften it. I did not leave anything out. When I finished, he was silent. Then he said, Dad knows? I said, He knows now. David looked at the floor. He said, I should have seen it. I said, You couldn't have. She was very good. At 8:45, Robert came downstairs. He looked at Linda. He looked at David. He said, Is everyone here? I said, Yes. He said, What do you want me to do? I said, Nothing. Just sit. At 8:58, we heard a vehicle pull up outside. I walked to the front window. A white van. Shady Pines Nursing and Rehabilitation printed on the side. The driver got out. He walked to the front door. He knocked. I did not answer. I waited. 30 seconds later, I heard a car pull up. I looked out the window. Celeste's car. She got out. She walked quickly to the front door. She knocked. She called out, Robert? Margaret? I opened the door. She smiled. She said, Good morning. The van is here. Are you ready? I said, No. The smile faltered, just slightly. She said, What do you mean? I said, I'm not going. She looked past me. She saw Linda. She saw David. She saw Robert sitting on the couch. Her expression shifted, confusion, then calculation, then something close to panic. She said, Margaret, we talked about this. You're going to Shady Pines, it's all arranged. I said, No, I'm not. She said, Robert, tell her. Robert did not move. He did not look at her. She said, Robert? I reached into my pocket. I took out the recorder. I held it up. I said, Would you like to hear what you said yesterday? About the facility in Bangor? About the house? About the $400,000? Her face went very still. She looked at the recorder. She looked at me. She said, I don't know what you're talking about. I pressed play. Her voice filled the living room, clear and unmistakable. The facility in Bangor is cheaper, $900 a month. No, Robert doesn't know. He thinks she's going to Shady Pines, but that place costs $9,000 a month. Why would I waste that kind of money? I let it play. Celeste's hands stopped moving. She had been reaching for the recorder. Now her fingers hung in the air, frozen. Her eyes moved from the recorder to me, then to Robert, then to David. The recording continued. The house closes on the 19th. $400,000. My cousin in New Hampshire. I pressed stop. The silence that followed was complete. No one moved. No one spoke. I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. I could hear a car passing on the street outside. I could hear Celeste breathing. She recovered first. Of course she did. She straightened. She smiled. Not the warm smile she had used for months. A different one. Harder. She said, "Margaret, I think you misunderstood what you heard." I said nothing. I just looked at her. She said, "I was talking about options. Robert and I were exploring different facilities to find the best fit for you. That's all." I said, "You told someone on the phone that Robert didn't know you were planning to send me to a state facility instead of Shady Pines. You said you were going to pocket the difference." She laughed. A light sound. She said, "That's not what I said. You're confused." She looked at Robert. She said, "Robert, tell her. Tell her she's confused." Robert did not move. He was looking at the floor. His hands were folded in his lap. He did not look up. Celeste's smile faded. She said, "Robert?" He said quietly, "I heard it, Celeste." She stared at him. She said, "You heard what? A recording taken out of context?" She turned to me. She said, "Margaret, you've been having memory problems. Everyone knows that. You move things and forget where you put them. You can't keep track of your medications." Dr. Morrison confirmed it. I reached into my purse. I took out the letter from Dr. Chen. I unfolded it. I handed it to her. She took it. She read it. Her face changed, just slightly. A tightening around her mouth. I said, "Dr. Raymond Chen is my primary care physician. He confirmed in writing that I suffered a minor stroke with full recovery. No cognitive impairment, no memory loss. I am mentally competent to manage my own affairs." Celeste set the letter down on the coffee table. She said, "One doctor's opinion." I said, "Dr. Morrison is a dentist, not a neurologist." She said, "He's seen the effects of your stroke. He's concerned about you." I said, "He signed a medical statement without examining me. That's called fraud." Her jaw tightened. She looked at David. She said, "David, you've seen how your mother has been. Tell her she needs help." David looked at her, then at me. He did not speak. His hands were very still on his knees. Celeste said, "David, please," he said quietly. I heard the recording. She stared at him. She said, "You can't possibly believe." He said, "I heard you make that call 2 weeks ago. You were in my parents' kitchen. You used my mother's full legal name. You didn't ask how to spell it." Celeste's face went pale. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at Robert. She said, "Robert, listen to me. I was trying to help. I was trying to find the most affordable option. I didn't want you to go bankrupt paying for her care." Robert looked up. He said, "You were going to put her in a state facility and tell me she was at Shady Pines." She said, "I was protecting you." He said, "You were stealing from us." She said, "I wasn't stealing. I was managing." I reached into my purse again. I took out the bank statement from Portland Savings. I handed it to Robert. He looked at it. He looked at the withdrawals. $2,100. He set it down. He said, "You took this?" Celeste said, "Margaret gave me her card. She asked me to get cash for her." I said, "I didn't ask you to get cash. You took my card and told me you were holding it for safekeeping." She said, "You're lying." I said, "No, you're lying. And you've been lying since the day you walked into this house." Her expression changed. The warmth was gone. The concern was gone. What was left was something cold and calculating. She said, "You can't prove any of this." I said, "I just did." She said, "A recording isn't admissible in court. Neither is a letter from a doctor who's probably sleeping with you." Linda stood. She said, "That's enough." Celeste looked at her. She said, "Who are you?" Linda said, "I'm Margaret's friend. And I'm a witness. I heard the recording. I've seen the bank statements, and I'm prepared to testify to everything I've seen in this house over the past 2 months." Celeste laughed. She said, "Testify? You think this is going to court?" She looked at Robert. She said, "Robert, you're not going to let them do this to me. We've been planning our future together. You love me." Robert stood. He walked to the window. He did not look at her. He said, "I think you should leave." She said, "What?" He said, "I think you should leave. Now." She stared at him. She said, "Robert, you can't be serious." He turned. He looked at her. He said, "I am completely serious. Get out of my house." She said, "This isn't your house anymore. Margaret sold it, remember?" I said, "I sold my share. The closing is in 2 weeks. Until then, Robert and I are joint tenants, and we both want you to leave." She looked around the room, at me, at Robert, at David, at Linda. She picked up her purse from the floor. She stood. She said, "You're all going to regret this." She walked to the door. She turned. She said, "Margaret, you won't last 6 months on your own. You'll be back in a nursing home by Christmas, and no one will be there to visit you." I said, "I'll take that chance." She left. The door closed. The room was silent. Robert sat back down on the couch. He put his head in his hands. David stood and walked to the window. Linda sat beside me. She took my hand. Robert said, "I'm sorry, Margaret. I'm so sorry." I said, "I know." He said, "I thought I was helping you. I thought she cared about you." I said, "She didn't care about me. She cared about what I had." He looked up. He said, "What happens now?" I opened my purse. I took out another document. I handed it to him. He read it. He looked at me. He said, "What is this?" I said, "It's the ownership file for Foster and Callahan's seafood processing. My father transferred 60% ownership to me in 1996. It's held in an irrevocable trust. The current value is $4,732,000. Robert stared at the paper. He read it again. He said, "Your father owned a seafood company." I said, "He was a partner. Then he bought out the other partner. Then he gave most of it to me." Robert said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know. That was the point." He set the paper down. He said, "So you don't need this house." I said, "No, I don't need this house. But I wanted it. It was mine, and I wasn't going to let her take it." David turned from the window. He said, "Mom, I'm sorry. I should have seen what was happening." I said, "You couldn't have. She was very good at what she did." He said, "I should have believed you." I said, "You believe me now. That's what matters." Linda stood. She said, "I should go." She looked at me. She said, "Call me if you need anything." I walked her to the door. I hugged her. I said, "Thank you for being here." She said, "Always." 2 weeks later, the house sold. The closing was on a Thursday morning at Sarah Lim's office. I signed the papers. Robert signed his waiver. He did not contest my claim. He did not ask for half. The check was deposited into my trust account the same day. $479,000. I moved into a small apartment on Munjoy Hill. 1 bedroom, hardwood floors, a view of Casco Bay. I could see the water from my kitchen window. I unpacked slowly. I hung the photographs from the mantel. I set up my father's desk in the corner of the living room. I put the small voice recorder in the drawer. I did not need it anymore, but I kept it. One Saturday morning in early May, I was sitting at the kitchen table drinking tea when I heard a knock at the door. I opened it. David was standing there. He did not say anything. He stepped inside. He walked to the kitchen counter. He set down a framed photograph. It was a picture of David and me from his college graduation. He had bought the frame that morning. I could still see the price sticker on the back. He kissed me on the forehead. He said, "I love you, Mum." Then he left. I picked up the photograph. I looked at it for a long time. Then I set it on the counter where he had placed it. I walked to the window. I looked out at the bay. The water was calm. The sky was clear. I thought about my father's words. A woman who controls her own money controls her own life. I understood now what he had meant. It was never about the money. It was about the choice, the ability to walk away when someone tried to take what was yours, the ability to say no, the ability to stand in your own kitchen and know that no one could move you unless you decided to move yourself. Sometimes the most dangerous people in your life are the ones who smile the most, the ones who offer to help when you're at your weakest, the ones who tell you they're protecting you while they're taking everything you have. Celeste didn't see me as a person. She saw me as an obstacle between her and the life she wanted. And when I became inconvenient, she tried to erase me. She wasn't evil. Not in the way we think of evil. She was terrified. Terrified of being poor again. Terrified of being alone. Terrified of losing control. And that fear made her capable of things most people would never imagine. But here's what she didn't understand. Fear makes you desperate. And desperation makes you sloppy. She underestimated me because I was quiet. Because I was 67 years old. Because I had just recovered from a stroke. She thought quiet meant weak. She thought age meant helpless. She was wrong. My father understood something that took me 67 years to fully grasp. He understood that the world tries to make women dependent. It tries to convince us that we need someone else to manage our money, our property, our lives. And the moment we believe that, we lose everything. Not just our money, our autonomy, our dignity, our ability to say, "This is mine, and you cannot take it." That's why he built the company. That's why he transferred ownership to me. That's why he wrote that letter and sealed it in an envelope and waited for the day I would need it. He knew that day would come. He just didn't know when. Here's the truth no one tells you. The people who try to control you will always tell you it's for your own good. They'll say you're confused. They'll say you're not capable. They'll say they're protecting you. And if you're not careful, you'll start to believe them. You'll start to second-guess yourself. You'll start to think, maybe they're right. Maybe you are losing your memory. Maybe you did move those glasses. Maybe you do need help. That doubt is their weapon. And the moment you surrender to it, they win. But if you hold on to one small piece of certainty, One small fact that you know is true. You can build everything else back from there. For me, it was my father's voice. A woman who controls her own money, controls her own life. I held on to that, and it held me. If this story touched you in any way, I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever had someone try to convince you that you were less capable, less certain, less worthy than you knew yourself to be? Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Are you in Sydney at dawn, or Chicago at midnight? Tell me in the comments below. I read every single one. And if stories like this matter to you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. There are more stories coming. Stories of women who refuse to disappear. Stories of quiet strength that no one saw coming. You are stronger than anyone ever told you, and you always have been.